thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share my experiences. And my purpose in doing so is really so that it's twofold, so that I can encourage others to find their voice and to ask questions and to stand for reality. And the second reason is that I would really like to connect with others who have the same concerns as I do. And I'm sure there are many teachers that have had similar experiences and have similar concerns as I do, so that we can bring it to the greater Waldorf community as a conversation. We need to be able to discuss it. So that said, what makes me different than, say, the rest of my colleagues at the last school I was at, in which they felt the same way as I did, but they said nothing. They let me stand alone. So, and I do understand, when a livelihood is threatened, people will maybe not speak up, and I totally get that, and I don't judge people for that. However, I do believe that we do need to stand up for it. So let me just say that as a child, I went to a different school every grade. We moved a lot, and so I was always an outsider. And that has followed me. That's become a part of who I am, so that I'm not so embedded in a community that I feel like I would be losing a lot if I was kicked out. And I self-schooled at age 14. The school that I was going to at the time felt like a prison. And I had had a spiritual awakening when I was 12 years old. And I was like, this is not for me. Let me out of here. So I got out legally and I went straight to the library to self-educate. But I realized that that also gives me the opportunity to be thinking on my own and not the groupthink that is inculcated in so many high school experiences. And from age 12 to age 18, I was involved in Scientology. And that is a cult, so I have an experience of cult thinking. And one of the hallmarks is that it can't be questioned. Another hallmark is it's very insular. So the crack in the egg for me, what got me out of it, was when I was 18 years old and I was talking to my Scientology friends, and they were putting down my non-Scientology friends, and I thought, they don't even know them. Why are they saying these things? And that was enough of a question for me to say, this is weird, and then begin to question everything else. So questioning is a good thing. I want you all to know that I have voted Democrat all my life until this last election, and I am now no party. And I'm choleric. So I think that those are all things that you can kind of know about me and my biography. I have taught in Waldorf. I have taught as a Waldorf educator for 25 years. I began in early childhood for 10 or more years. And then when my youngest was in 7th grade, I decided to become a class teacher. And so I've worked at 3 schools, and it was at the last one that I had these experiences. I did not have any of these experiences at the former schools. And so that was in 2022 until this past May. Graduated in an 8th grade class. I was teaching 6th through 8th grade. I do live in California, but that's the only identification I'm going to give about the schools or the individuals involved, because there's that's not really the point, because I think that you can find this at just about every school now, every Waldorf school in the country. In fact, I believe there was only one school in the country that didn't sign on to the Principle 8, the DEI principle in OSNA's documents.
Yeah.
One school stood out. So anyways, research that on your own. So that's a little bit about how I came to be a person who would see something and question it and speak up.
Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, thank you. So when did you first start seeing these trends from outside the Waldorf community starting to find their way into it?
Well, It was really at this last school. So one of the things that happened was I was hired to take a sixth grade, and having never taught middle school before, one of the things I knew I needed to do was confront and investigate the question of what is transgender, because it had been really at the periphery of my consciousness. I always considered a civil rights issue, like, hey, everybody deserves dignity and civil rights. Leave these people alone. They deserve this. And then the first crack in the egg came when I read about Leah Thomas, who was Will Thomas, decided to be female, and was taking titles from women in swimming in the NCAA and at Penn State. And that Penn State was siding with that. And it was my first shock of going like, are you kidding me? And if you've seen any photographs of Will Thomas, he's 6'4". He's got broad shoulders, narrow hips. Q angle means a lot in sports. And he's got the male junk under his women's suit. So that was the first time I really said, wait a second here, wait a second. Like, I'm all for everyone having basic human rights, rights for employment and dignity and courtesy, etc. But this is getting strange. So I did investigation on my own. So it started July of 2022. And then when I came to work at this school, at one of the faculty meetings, the topic came up, and one of the teachers said, I wish there was an anthroposophical source for understanding this issue. And I said, well, Eugene Schwartz put together like a weekend lecture series. Perhaps we could get a group deal, all listen to it, and then come back and discuss it. And then the administrator of the school summarily said, I don't want to hear from an old white man. And that kind of ended that conversation. Now, I'm going to say it right now, and I'll probably say it throughout, is what I have learned, a little late in the game, but I have learned, is that the best thing to do is just ask why. I could have said, why? Why do you feel that way? Right? Because in truth, when these comments came my way, I was really so flabbergasted, like, whoa, never heard that before. So that was just a surprise to me. Other things started happening. Somebody I worked with said the year before I came, there was a discussion about taking all of the class readers that had been written by white men out of the bookshelves and discarding them. And she said, are you crazy? Like, there goes Charlotte's Web. And that ended that conversation. They said, oh, and never brought it up again. But she was the same one that came to me when it was Advent time. It was 7:30 in the morning. We were setting up the Advent table outside and nobody else around. And she whispers to me, can I say Jesus? In the story that she was going to tell. And I said very loudly, yes, you can say Jesus. But that's the way it's become. If you're cis, hetero, white, Christian, this is just really out of vogue. And so she really felt that she had to ask me, can I say Jesus? I kind of got in trouble with this faculty also about dress code. There was no dress code for the girls, and really they were wearing their pants zipped down and things like this. And so there was only one other person who stood with me on this, but I said, could we at least have a compromise and have dress code for public events? And the answer was no, because that's body shaming to girls. And my perspective is no, it's guidance for these girls. And other people have, it has effects on other people. Other people have reactions to it. I was thinking about grandparents and such. And the response I got was, if you have a problem with it, it's your problem.
Yeah.
And I felt that there was no part of the conversation that honored me and my feelings. And I've looked into it a lot. And, I'm not a prude. And what it came down to was two things. If someone is dressing as bait, in other words, in a sexually suggestive way, that's bait clothing. But other than that, wearing very skimpy clothing in a classroom is too intimate for me. And so I do like a little bit of decorum, like, bring those shorts down to mid-calf, please. Instead of like really wearing shorts that were like volleyball shorts. They could have been wearing bathing suits in class and nobody would have said anything. So I kind of got in trouble around dress code. And at this point, I want to say a little something about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is based on immutable characteristics like diversity of skin color rather than viewpoint diversity. So you see, they really want a conformity of expressed viewpoints, right? And then equity, which most people don't know what equity means. It's like, well, I understand it in buying a house, and owning a house or something like that. But equity, if you think about it in terms of DEI, has to do with someone's social investment. Like this group was marginalized for so long. They now have like a social equity that needs to get like repaid kind of thing. So we're going to make it easier for them to get into college, for example, or we're going to have quotas and affirmative action and things like that. So it's got nothing to do with equality and everything to do with making an equal outcome, no matter what. So it's not based on merit. And then finally, the inclusion part. Well, everybody's included except the ones that don't agree with you. They did not ask me back. And I'll tell you the truth. I told them, it's mutual. I know we're really not on the same page here, so I graduated that 8th grade and all. But two things. One, DEI is born of an extremism, an absolutism, if you will. And anytime you try to have an absolute result, you'll have disaster. So just as one example, in agriculture, pest control. In efforts to eliminate all pests, they will spray all these chemicals. And of course, it backfires because the pests become tolerant of the pesticide and come back with a vengeance because you've also killed the ones that would have kept them in check. So rather than have like this homeostasis, this balance, this dynamic that happens whenever there's this extremism, and it ends up backfiring and becoming disastrous. So the extremism in this case is compassion. We must be tolerant and compassionate of everyone. And if you have any questions about that, then we're not tolerant of you. I mean, there's gays and lesbians that can't go to pride parades right now. So just saying, it's really skewed. So that's what I wanted to say about that. And also, Waldorf schools have always been diverse as possible. And I think Eugene Schwartz makes a great point. If you want more people of color at your school, well, place your school in the inner city. But we place our schools in the suburbs, in the beautiful countryside, right? And most of the people that live there are white, right? But even so, we have diversity in our schools. We don't turn anybody away because we are inclusive. And so this is another complaint of mine, is that the only time I've seen Waldorf schools not be inclusive is when a parent couldn't pay the tuition. When a family couldn't pay the tuition, they were asked to leave.
Right.
There are some other cases of extreme behaviors or something like that, but otherwise, we take them all in, even the ones we can't serve very well because we're so inclusive. We've always been inclusive, right? Anyways, so that's my little thing about DEI.
Yeah.
But the majority of what happened for me happened with transgender ideology. So I'll
Pronouns
pause right
also.
now in case you have a question, because before I launch into that whole story, but that's the huge story that I have is really
Yeah.
around.
Yeah, well, that would interest us all, I think, is to hear how the whole pronoun thing went at your school and how different teachers tried to address it, or did they, or yeah, what kind of what
Well,
kind of
okay, so we were rolling along just fine. There was a student that was in the 7th grade when I was in 6th, and the 8th grade when I was in 7th. and female, but went by they, them, and had a name that had gotten changed to a masculinized name. It was no issue at all. Again, this has been my experience in Waldorf schools, is we are very open and inclusive and accepting of everyone. This was a child who was, collaborating with their parents on their transition, their social transition. I believe sometimes she wore a binder, but other than that, I didn't know much about it, except that she was just accepted as a fellow student with the same respect and support, encouragement, like when we're out playing volleyball or whatnot. So, so that was not an issue. What became an issue for me was I had two interesting students. One was, everybody thought this girl was a boy and used the pronoun he and was gently corrected, myself included. And it's quite possible that that student had a difference of sexual development called 5-ARD, which is when the testosterone, the testicles do not descend, and male puberty doesn't happen on the outside, except for, like, say, musculature and things like that. But this individual had a deeper voice, was extremely aggressive, actually very angry a lot. So there's something going on beneath all of that, but dressed in a more masculinized fashion. However, claimed that she was a girl. She was just a different kind of girl. Completely accepted by everybody, no issue. Then I had another student, and this student suffered from anxiety and ADHD and was on medication and was on at least 6 different social media sites, because when we talked about those things in class, that came up. A very creative, quirky, poetic young woman, very creative, very intelligent. And yet she had these other issues, and she would show up at the door for the handshake sometimes looking like Marilyn Monroe with a hangover. Clearly, she was up at night and not sleeping. She had insomnia, whatever. So, I did my best with her. And one day she said, I'd like to make an announcement to the class. I want to change my pronouns to they, them. And I said, well, that's a big deal to get people to change, the pronouns that they use. So let's talk about this at lunch. So I did talk to her at lunch. And she said, I just don't feel like a girl. I don't feel like a boy. I'm just me. And I said, well, you kind of hit upon a basic truth there. Most people feel exactly like that. And I suggested that we have a conversation with her parents before we went ahead and did anything at school, because it would be a big deal. All the subject teachers, all the students. So she said, I don't want my parents to know. I said, okay. We talked a little more. But then she said, I want to go play. Okay, go play. We'll talk tomorrow. Because I didn't know what to do. So I called my mentor that night, and she said, oh, you can't tell the parents. In California, it's the law. And I went, oh, okay. I took that on face value. And then the girl didn't want to talk about it for a while. I asked her, do you want to talk about it some more? No. And in the springtime, she came out with her pronouns, but by this time she had her parents on board at that point with her. And at that point, the school had downloaded a document from Gender Spectrum about what to do with children that wanted to transition at school. And in 3 different places on that document, it says what to do with parents, what to say to the parents, how to deal with the documentation if the parents don't know. And so that I did research and discovered that it's not the law. Oh, another thing about this young lady is nothing else changed about her except that she started having rainbow accessories. She would excitedly come to school and say, look at my shoelaces, or look at the pin I have with rainbows and things. Nothing else changed about her. And so it was really difficult for the other students to track the they, them. It was difficult. They tried. Then I did research and found out that it wasn't the law. When I Googled, searched it, what came up was the California Department of Education frequently asked questions page. And it used language like a child may this or may that if, if they're not affirmed, etc. And then it was really strange because the second paragraph mentioned FERPA, and which is very strange because FERPA is when the parents give permission for the records to be seen by somebody else, not the school withholding records from the parents. So I knew I was in very strange territory. But then the other thing that happened was there was a school in California, a public school, that made a policy, as a school board, made a policy that parents had to be told within 3 days. And then they were sued by the California Attorney General. And in the court proceedings, it was discovered there actually was no law. So even the Attorney General didn't know there was no law. So they did this huge backtrack, and the legislature came out with something which passed. And it basically says that a teacher can tell the parents and won't get in trouble. The teacher that can withhold from the parents and won't get in trouble. And schools or school districts cannot make a policy of having to tell the parents. Cannot make it mandatory to tell the parents. So they can still obfuscate. When I first learned about this, I emailed leadership at school and asked, could we please have this as a discussion item at our faculty meeting for a couple reasons. One is not everyone knows about this rule or this school policy. And two, I believe it goes against our principles here in Waldorf. And it has always been my experience that we stay in close communication with parents, and we share what's going on with their child, especially something that could have ramifications long-term and irreversible for this child. And I knew I was never in a position, I knew their children for 3 years. I did not know them better than that. I was not financially responsible or medically responsible for this child. So I had a lot of questions. Could we please discuss it? I was told, no, we don't have time in our large faculty meeting, but you can speak with people individually and you can take it up at a lesser meeting. So it did get 40 minutes at a lesser meeting, and the pedagogical director came on very strong, saying that children who are affirmed, or if they don't want their parents to know, their parents might turn them out of the house, and then they will be on the streets and they will be sex trafficked. And exactly. I said, well, that may have happened to some children, and that is tragic. However, let's talk about our own population here. We're at a Waldorf school. Do you really think that any of the parents here would turn their child out of the house? We got nowhere with this. What was also interesting to note, there was 5 other people at that meeting, and they had no opinion. They say, I don't know enough about it. I have no opinion. Even one woman said, I have no opinion, but my husband works in a high school. He's a high school teacher. And he says, kids are changing their pronouns every day, kind of, comes and goes. So that said, things moved on. And then the following year, they had a woman come to speak to the whole faculty, the whole hour-and-a-half faculty meeting. All the teachers were there. And so she devoted one whole meeting to this woman who worked for a group called Rainbow Coalition, which posited themselves as, it was Phoenix Coalition, excuse me, Phoenix Coalition. It purported to be an anti-bullying group. When I went on the website, all of their external links were to transgender topics, finding transgender therapists and things like that. So she came and she had a unique hairstyle, short on one side, long on the other. And she said that she was non-binary, and her pronouns were they or she. I'm like, okay. And she went on for quite a while about intersex conditions proving, or should I say disproving, the sex binary. I told myself I was not going to disrupt this presentation. And so I kept quiet, and I kind of beat myself up afterwards, thinking I should have said something. Um, but I didn't. But I listened to that, and I listened to her say, well, transgender just means somebody who wants to be the opposite sex or no sex at all. Because, I could have raised my hand and said, well, if you say opposite sex, aren't you implying a binary? And also when she said that puberty blockers are reversible, and that they give a child a chance to think. When you know what happens in puberty is the development of long-term planning, the executive function, cause and effect thinking, right? The kind of thinking that would actually allow them to sort of look down the road and see where this would lead them. They nullify that with those blockers. They block that puberty. And puberty is not just external genitalia.
Right.
It's huge. So all that happened. Yeah. But then that, I have to say, in the summer between 6th and 7th, before 7th grade, I met a woman who had detransitioned. And that was also really eye-opening for me. It was a friend of a friend, and I asked for the opportunity to interview her. And I found out that she was 22, and she had overdosed on marijuana edibles, and had a psychotic break. And I think that's an important factor in her story, because it was after that she was swayed by transgender friends into transitioning. So she began testosterone at 22, and she stopped at 32. And now she has a male voice, and she has no chest. She had her breasts removed. She has a pear-shaped figure and wears dresses, but it's really confusing because she's got a really deep voice. And she still has facial hair. She said a lot of the extra hair, like that was on her arms, went away. I said, why did you decide to stop taking the testosterone at 32? And she said, I finally found a therapist who could get me to do my inner work. I said, do you have any message for my 7th graders? And she said, do your inner work, because you can't change something on the inside by manipulating something on the outside. And so it was really profound for me. Very courageous woman to speak with me. And then before 8th grade, at the back to school meetings, we had a discussion about purchasing a puberty curriculum. And those were middle school meetings. And so we had discussions about that. And then we went back to the big meeting. And the other teachers from the lower grades were upset. They said, we thought this was going to be a conversation we could all have, because we want a puberty curriculum too. Because we've got some girls in 3rd grade who are getting their period or something like this, right? And so that's when I gave a little speech about how Waldorf education is an implicit education. In other words, we elicit the child's learning by activities that we do. The curriculum is designed for it. The games that we do, the stories that we tell, bring them to an understanding. We work through metaphor so often with the younger ages. They all nodded and then carried on and decided that they would call their topic, instead of puberty, they would call it human development. And they were going to add that to their curriculum starting in 1st grade. Deep breath. Yeah. Then school started. And an email came out saying, well, we need to decide on a time that we can have this speaker, this woman named Anoush, who came from the coalition. We want her to come and speak to the children but it was really like it was a done deal. We just need to find out when we can schedule her in. So I immediately wrote an email to the pedagogical director who had sent that email and said, when was this decision made? Who made this decision? This is the first I'm hearing about it, and I am opposed to it. And, blah, 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 blah. And why are you bringing someone in from the outside? Why can't we teach this ourselves? And this was 8th grade. So I met with them. The original proposed schedule had her coming twice to speak to the students before having a presentation for the parents. And I tried to have a conversation about identity is fluid. It's based on feeling and thinking and stereotypes and things like this, not on biological sex. Can we separate out the two? And they listened to me, respectfully, and then carried on, wanted to have this schedule. And the one thing I was able to achieve was having the parents have their presentation before it all began. I said, wouldn't that be a good idea? So parents could opt out if they want to, because this is a controversial topic. And the first response I got to that request was, we never tell parents what we're going to do. Now, when bullshit comes your way, and you have to decide in that moment, am I going to argue that point, or shall I stay on this track? So I let that one fly over, and then a couple minutes later brought up my point again. But could we please have her come speak to the parents before she speaks to the children? So they did schedule that like a month before. When it ended up happening was she came and she gave the presentation to parents, and it was virtually the same as the one for the faculty, and I was able to ask questions then. However, she was not forthcoming with answers. And one of my questions was about the intersex. Isn't that like a red herring? Because seriously, transgender means wanting to be the opposite sex, not like you have something, a disorder of your sexual development. And really, how many intersex people call themselves transgender? Her answers were a no-go on all these things. And then one dad who was very, very conscientious, he's a lawyer, and he said, you've spoken to us for over an hour as if everything is fact that you said. However, I know that these things are still controversial. There's still argument about them. Would you be willing to have dialogue about some of the points that you made? And she said, no, there's a lot of misinformation out there. It's all false. And so there you go. So again, the way to address this is not try to put forth your facts, because they're not listening. In fact, okay, sorry. So I'll come back to it. But what happened was, what you have to do is you just have to ask why. You have to get them to do the talking, get them to hear themselves speaking about it. When we speak about something, it helps form our thinking. We see that in the first 3 years of life. The child stands upright, then they speak, and then they have memory and thinking. They can address their memory and their thinking. So it's actually really no different. So get them to talk, ask them questions, ask them why. Kind of learned all this the hard way. Anyways, so I went to my faculty in December. She was coming in January, February. Yeah. And so I said, oh yeah, she was coming in February. I said, in January, when we get back, could I please give you a presentation of why I'm so opposed to this? They took that to section meetings and came back and said, no, nobody wants to hear your presentation. So, gotta say, I was so amped up to give this presentation that I spent a week of my winter break putting together like PowerPoint slides with citations. And that's the other thing that lady has, no citations. She's got no degree in biology. She's just basically an activist. But it was like a data dump for me. And it was the best thing I did, because having researched for 2.5 years, I was just overflowing with information. I was brimming and I was just wanting to tell everybody. And that's the wrong approach, completely the wrong approach. So when I did this data dump and I got it all out there, because it's like the Medusa, it's like a head with many snakes that are out to get you, and so it was really good for me. And later I'll give you my email address and I'll send that to anybody who wants it. I asked if I could give the presentation. They said no. And in a follow-up conversation with the pedagogical director, she said, quote, "There's nothing you can tell me that would change my mind." I went to the leadership and I said, I don't think that we should be celebrating pride, because progressive pride now is an umbrella for all sorts of things that we would not be in favor of. The administrator said, like what? And so I wasn't, I just pulled something out of the air. I said, like drag queen story hour. The administrator, who was a former kindergarten teacher, said, I'm in favor of drag queen story hour. And again, I failed to ask why. So that's why, I keep saying it. Arm yourself, practice. Why? Oh, why do you think that? What leads you to believe that? That kind of thing. Because I was just stultified. I was like, oh. So that's a lot of what happened. I want to talk a little bit about teaching human physiology in 7th grade, but I want to pause because I've been talking a lot. And so I want to make sure that we're covering what you want me to talk about.
Yeah, no, I think this is just what people have been asking about, and the kind of things that people are hoping to go deeper into. And I do want to hear about how you see the core principles of Waldorf education and how they relate to the various facets of DEI programs. And a couple of questions have come in from the audience. Would you like to hear that?
Sure.
Okay. So here's someone from New Hampshire says, given Steiner's well-documented stance on de-emphasizing race, how does implementation of DEI in the curricula help the children to overcome racial biases and unhealthy subjective stereotypes? And the quote from Steiner is, our first principle is to found a brotherhood across the whole world without concern for gender, race, color, and so on. That is the recognition of the soul that is common to all humanity, all the way into the passions. The purification must take place that makes itself evident that the same soul lives in your brother as in yourself.
I would say that Waldorf education has always been very diverse, and it's always been accepting of more diversity. I know that from my own experience with 2 children going through Waldorf schools and being a Waldorf teacher myself. Whenever there was a student that came from a different background and maybe it wasn't covered in the curriculum, the teacher found a way of including that. Invited the parent in to tell stories from that culture, foods, festivals, and things like that were always included. I think really it's an ethos of inclusion that you don't, if we were to say, okay, you have to materialistically hit every culture in the world, you couldn't do it, right? So which ones do you focus on? Well, you focus on the ones that are relative to the students and the ones that are relative to what you're trying to teach. I do think that we can always be open to learning viewpoint diversity. In other words, in how we talk and teach about the conquest of the Americas, you know? It's never one-sided, and it's never just this or just that. There was a lot that was already going on here when Cortez came over. There was a lot of greed that Cortez brought with him, so um, I think being able to explain history with through lines rather than specifics of who was the most marginalized, who was the most victimized, who was the most oppressed. Now, certainly call out oppression when you see it, when it happens, most definitely. But to dwell on it actually comes from a certain point of view called critical theory or critical education. So critical theory is taking Marxism and putting it into the social realm rather than the economic realm. And it happened at the Frankfurt School. And so those are like the basis of all queer theory, and critical theory come from there. And so there's this thing called the education of the oppressed that has taken hold in our educational systems. And so that's where we get this like a glorification of the victim kind of thing, rather than a simple explanation. I'm not saying to gloss it over, but when the time is right, tell the whole story.
Right.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that, so how does DEI support brotherhood? I would say that DEI doesn't. However, what we do in our Waldorf schools already, by bringing stories that the child can relate to, it actually brings them into contact with the world, and that develops an empathy. We can only
Mhm.
really develop empathy with that which we understand, can come in contact with, can interrelate with. And I think that we need to be able to distinguish between empathy, which in my vernacular is I can imagine what you're feeling. I've felt something similar. I can imagine what you're feeling, but I am actually not going through that. Your dog just died. Oh my gosh. I can imagine that's, what you're feeling. However, I can be here for you. I don't start crying and falling apart. That would, in my wording, would be sympathy. Going
Right.
too far into it. And it's not saying, not my problem. That's, of course, antipathy. So the empathy is developed um, through a process of making the world relatable to the child. So one of the essentials of Waldorf education and these living pictures, it means the definition is that the child can warm them. They can conjure that up, that picture in their own imagination. They warm it. They're interested in it. That plus, so that's, if you will, the more etheric side of things. And then the other side of things is the astral side, which is what we do in Waldorf education. It's essential, is we bring movement that is based on archetypes, eurythmy, form drawing, spatial dynamics. We are interweaving the theoretical, the archetypal, the spiritual with the will, that thinking with the will. And this then allows for a regulation of the feeling life. So I think what's happened with DEI, as in most things materialistic, they want this outcome, so they go right for it.
Mhm.
Instead of being an implicit education, what we want is embedded in every story. As kindergarten teachers, we tell the same story for 4 weeks. We make sure we've got content that's going to go deep into that child's soul. And I have had experiences of that myself, where I've had it's a long, I could talk all day, but where a fairy tale has popped up for me when I was 30 years old and explained something in my life. I actually had a heart attack. I had, it's called broken heart syndrome. And one of the ways that I healed it was I worked with the fairy tale, The Frog King. So these things, these tales that we tell are profound. And so to me, that's essential Waldorf, bringing the living pictures. These ideas come in something that the child has. So I actually, the calendar of the soul verse from a couple weeks back, from the 34th week. In secret, inwardly to feel how all that I've preserved of old is quickened by new risen sense of self. This shall awakening pour forth cosmic forces into the outer actions of my life and growing mold me into true existence. And to me, I get excited about this because this is what happens if we've done our job, helping the child build these living pictures and giving them these lawful movements, then they do actions which then mold them. Instead of when they're impoverished and they hit puberty and they say, I've got to create myself. Right? Puberty is like this
Yeah.
death process. They're in a
Right.
panic to find an identity. Whereas if what's happened before has helped to build an individual who can, through their actions, be a vehicle for these cosmic forces, and then that comes back and that forms who they are. So we can ask our friend who asked the question, did that help you at all? Did that address what
Yeah.
you were talking about at all, or did I ramble?
No, no. I think that's we're approaching the central point here, and shouldn't we also, when we're teaching these subjects about exploration and the migration of folks through the world, have in the background of our minds the knowledge that all the races and different groups of people have a sacred mission as part of humanity's evolution.
Mhm.
It,
Absolutely. And that is brought forth, when you study ancient China and you study the Golden Age of Arabia and such. You really shows that it is like an orchestra. This section comes more to the fore. Now this one comes more to the fore. Everyone has a part to play in that. And again, it's implicit. You don't have to say now, you know, you bring it forth in your curriculum. It's embedded in the curriculum.
in the story, in the
Yeah.
picture.
Yeah. So what I see with Waldorf schools and where we kind of have really kind of veered off is in an extreme sympathy, an extreme compassion, and also then you could say an extreme antipathy for the other side happening. And then it just becomes rather tribal. I know that's cliche by now, but it is. You can't help but think any other way. There was in the news, there was a group came to meet at the library, rented a room at the library, which anybody can rent, public place, right? And it was about boys and girls sports. And somebody came up to speak, and they misgendered that person. They used the wrong pronouns for that person, and they were kicked out. They were kicked out of the library by the head librarian. Mm-hmm. And then subsequently, the library received, I think, 2 or 3 bomb threats.
Ooh.
Yeah. And when I read all the reporting on it, the police were saying, we're still investigating. We don't know who made those threats. They were anonymous threats. We don't know who made them. When this came up in conversation with the aforementioned pedagogical director, she said, it was those people, that misgendered. It was them. It was Moms for Liberty. And I said, how do you know this? And she goes, well, it's obvious, isn't it? And I thought, how can I talk to this? You know, I could say, well, go read the papers. Even the police are saying they don't know who did it. Right. So, um, but that's the kind of thinking that just becomes so set and fixed.
Yeah.
Um, so that's why it's really good to ask why, because maybe, heck, maybe you'd learn something. But when they want to give examples about clownfish and things like that, you just say, that's good for clownfish, but our reproductive strategy works a little differently than that. Um, Speaking of which, can I talk now a little bit about physiology?
Yeah, yeah, I'd love
Teaching,
to hear
I
that. Yeah.
taught human physiology in seventh grade. Before I began the block, I went to speak with the pedagogical director, and I said, I just want to be very upfront with you and tell you that I'm going to teach that there are two sexes. And we argued. We went around. I give her that. We like went 7 rounds on it. No, it's a spectrum. No, it's two. But it wasn't much of a conversation. But I said, here's the deal. That's the ground I stand upon. And if you want me to do something else, I will not. And you can ask for my resignation. I won't do this. And she didn't ask for my resignation. I went ahead and taught it. What happened was I just started with all the systems, starting with digestive, etc. So we ran through the systems. We got to the endocrine system, and then we got to puberty, and then we got to the reproductive system. And then I had a beautiful, beautiful lesson on conception, because it's so beautiful and so sacred. And I was really able to impart that with the students. And we actually worked with fairy tales too, and letting them to discuss the metaphors in the fairy tales. So that was something new for them. Then on our last day, I said, do you have any questions about transgender? They said, yeah, we want you to talk, tell us about this. So the first thing I did is I said, we need to talk about language, because that's one of the first things that you'll encounter, is that the language gets confused. The first word I want to go over with you is the word normal. What does the word normal mean? Now, these are children that had a really good Waldorf upbringing. They were squarely set. They said, well, it means what you can usually expect. I said, you're right. And what can you usually expect? They said male and female. I said, these kids are going to be fine. So then we went over the terms, like, what does this mean? What does cis mean? What does trans mean? Whatever all these different things mean. And then I said, do you want to know about the stages of transition? They said, yeah. Yeah. So here's the thing. I know all these kids are on the internet. They're going to get all sorts of information on the internet. And I don't want anyone walking away thinking that this is an easy road to follow, whether we agree with it or not. So, and that's basically how I framed it. I just said, well, the first phase is just what they call social transition: haircut, clothing, name change, pronouns, nothing is permanent. And then there's puberty blockers. And we talked about that. I had one girl in my class who was autistic, and she was avoiding her puberty. And what she did was she stopped eating and she ran all over the place. Like, she would run to school. And then she started falling asleep in class. So again, I called the parents. I talked to the parents. They did some investigation. It turns out that she did not want to get her period. She was smart. She read all sorts of adult medical literature, and she was like, this is how I can forestall my period. This is what I'm going to do.
Reduce your body fat enough.
Well, yeah, because, so yes, exactly. And so she thought it was too messy. So she was the one that raised her hand and said, well, what if you just continue to take puberty blockers? And I was like, okay, because there are some children that are asking for this. They never want to become an adult. So I said, do you remember when we were talking about the nervous system and talking about the brain and how the brain develops? And do you remember what happens in puberty with brain development? And they said, yeah, it's that long-term thinking. It's like, and I said, yeah, well, imagine what would happen if you didn't have that development. So, and then I told them a little bit about the surgeries. And, not everyone knows that when you create a hole in the human body, that it wants to close up. No one says that when a woman takes testosterone, she goes through an early menopause. So the vagina will atrophy and won't work anymore. The uterus, sometimes there's so much pain that they have to get a hysterectomy. So I didn't go into like every detail about how horrid this can be, but just enough so that they could see of like, what is the procedure if, like a female wanted to have something that looked like a penis? Well, then they take a chunk of flesh out of the arm or the thigh. And I said, and then what's really sad is that with any surgery, there can be complications. And so there's complications, and they have to go back into surgery several times to fix things. And sometimes when they urinate, it doesn't come out the right place, and it can be messy. And I said, so it's not easy. They were kind of like, ooh. And I said, that's enough. I just want you to know that if anyone says to you, oh, you can just change your sex, you can't, right? And it's not easy. And we can't close this discussion without agreeing that whatever someone chooses, we respect their decision. And these kids said, of course, like that's the way they are. Like, of course, it's not just knowing that but it's not an easy choice.
Right.
And so, but I did want them to know a little bit about it because of so much of the other rainbows and unicorns, and it's just so sweet. Be
Right.
yourself, be bold, be brave.
It is sobering.
It is. Yeah, sorry if that's too much for the audience here. But that's the reality of it. And that's why I don't take it lightly. And that's why I don't think that, okay, let me just reverse that. I think an essential part of Waldorf education is to get children to accept and love their bodies so that they can be fully functional in the world, so that they can achieve their destiny. And, you know, that's what I think. I think I'll do everything in my power to facilitate that spiritual being and becoming embodied so that they can fulfill their task here on earth.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what you see as the central core of the Waldorf educational impulse then.
Mhm. You know, um, the central impulse is send them forth in freedom.
Right.
And so it's also freedom to think. So um, it was really challenging to teach modern history in 8th grade when you have to, but we did. We covered the Cultural Revolution in China, etc. And we discussed how easy it is to cling to one side or another, and how challenging it is to stay in the middle and question what's going on. So, yeah. So that, sending them forth in freedom.
Right.
And instead of saying, well, it's like this, and that's all it is.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's an even deeper question than trying to answer should we this, should we not. is what is it that's going to support exactly that? Sending the child forth in freedom, giving them the support and feeding them the beauty that is going to enable them to recognize their destiny for their life, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Offering them beauty so that they can warm it, so they can embody it. Absolutely. Um, the woman never came to speak to the students. Um, as I said, there were people, I spoke with many of the teachers and staff about this issue, and they expressed sentiments very similar to mine, but they never spoke up. But I did have a couple parents write to the administration and go in and speak to the administration, but they were still going ahead with it. And then it hit the sixth grade, which, got to say, had nothing to do with this, but an email went out to the sixth grade parents about these talks coming up, and they got in an email battle. Parents started fighting each other on email. So they shut that down, had them come in person, and then the battle ensued in person. And then the administration decided not to hold the talks, and they said it wasn't because of the sixth grade parents, but they said, we're going to find other ways to bring it. And when I
Right.
left, they put out a document, a DEI document with different categories of what they would do. It was an Excel doc. So for every grade, what they would do for the different things. So they were going to tell queer fairy tales in kindergarten, etc. Straight on through, because they feel it's their mission to. So here again, the goal is that we have children come out of our schools that can have empathy for others, can be accepting of differences,
Right.
can be respectful of human dignity, no matter how someone presents. That's what you want. That's the goal. The mainstream way of doing it is go straight to it. Just teach it, teach it, teach it, teach it, teach it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The
It,
children can't warm that. They
yeah.
can't warm that. It doesn't become their own.
Right.
There was a boy who came to, I guess, one of the other grades, forget fourth or fifth grade, and he, I believe it's Sikh or Sikh. He had his hair in a bun with the covering on it, and so when he was coming to visit the school, to visit the class, the pedagogical director sent out an email to all teachers saying, "Talk to your students and tell them not to tease that boy."
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, my kids were in seventh grade, and I was like, I felt really awkward because it was such a, like, what do you mean? Um, and I said that to them, like, hey, this boy's coming in, he wears this thing. So, it's a little odd, but we won't comment or, make fun of it or whatever. And one of my students raised his hand and said, Miss Blair, why did you tell us that? Well, like, why did you think you had to tell us that?
Mm.
They were, he was insulted. I don't know, maybe the
Yep.
rest of them were too, but he was
Right.
offended and insulted that I would think that he would even think that. Because in Waldorf education, it's implicit, it's built into everything we do that there are differences, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and they all play a part. So, yeah, let's see. How are we
Yeah.
doing here?
Good. What I'm kind of hearing is that what we maybe think is first and foremost is that we need to talk about things. We need to listen and we need to ask questions like why. And whenever you see a situation where you say why or you say, can we talk about this? And then they're like, there's no need to talk about it, it's settled. That
Mhm.
ought to be a big red flag for us.
Yes. So I think my approach was the fail. I think that there were opportunities, like in that lesser committee when 40 minutes was designated. I could have asked a lot of questions. When I spoke with the middle school staff about that woman coming to speak to the children, I presented a lot of information. I could have asked a lot of questions. And that's what I'm learning now. With genuine curiosity. What makes you believe that? Can you
Right.
explain that to me? Because I'm not seeing it that way. Could you, try explaining it to me as if I know nothing about it?
Hmm.
Um, like, I'm trying to understand you. Can you please explain it? I think that'll get us farther because then they're saying it themselves. And when they hear themselves say something like, if a girl says she's a boy, she's a boy. Okay. You know, so,
Simple as that, right?
as simple as that. Yeah. A couple of other things that I wanted to bring up is this celebrating pride didn't happen until the end of my first year there when I was teaching sixth grade. A parent had some stencils and some chalkboard paint, spray cans of
Yeah.
chalk, and wanted to know who wanted to spray them on the sidewalks. So one of the teachers said, my class wants to do it. And then they did it. And then the next year they gave a little talk in the breezeway, which I did not hear. And then they made posters and they put posters up. And one of the posters had several pride flags on it, the different kinds of pride flags. And there was two that I didn't understand. And one, I looked them all up, but one of them was rubber and one of them was leather. Do you have any idea what those allude to?
Not sure. I want to know.
Well, they're sexual fetishes that employ latex or rubber or leather that are based on BDSM. So
Right.
some student, probably, it looked like maybe fourth grade, I couldn't tell, but some student had put up these flags, and suddenly at school, we've got flags for rubber and leather. And we went in, so this was the end of the school year because it's June, and we went into our end of the year faculty meetings. So I said to the pedagogical director, do you know, it was perfect. The poster was put up right next to the door when we went into our meeting. So I just said, do you know what those two mean? And put her nose in the air and said, well, I suppose they mean exactly what they say they mean. I said, you might want to look into it. They were down the next day. Um,
Right. And
you
this
know,
after we've spent the first 4 years just building up beautiful image after beautiful
yeah,
song, trying to nourish the souls of these children.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. So I want to end, if we're going to end soon, I want to end by giving some resources to people.
Yeah.
Um, so really, it's not so much DEI that I've been researching as the whole transgender ideology. And I would be happy to come back on and give my presentation about transgender
Okay.
ideology. But
There we go.
you'll notice it's probably like in about 8 chapters. I mean, the thing is, it's so it just pops up in all these different places. But so for resources, there's a really good podcast called Gender: A Wider Lens.
Hmm.
Um, Lots and lots of interviews, and they have the Pioneer series where they interview people who were doing this back in the 70s, working in sex and gender medicine and whatnot. So that's Gender: A Wider Lens. It's hosted by two psychologists. And then one of them has now gone on to a new podcast called Beyond Gender. And there's just really, really articulate and relevant interviews in there that they conduct. A really good, you can find it on YouTube or you can find it on a podcast. It's put out by Sex Matters, which is a group in the UK. And this one's called Why Sex Matters with Helen Joyce. And she goes over in detail, and it's conversational, and yet it's like a college lecture. You get all the details about intersex, which, just spoiler alert, intersex conditions are sexed conditions. So one is either male or female, but there's this disorder in the development or a difference in the development that does not allow one to procreate.
Right.
And sometimes that can be overridden medically. but they are always either male or female. Hermaphrodism is either extremely rare or non-existent because it depends on how you want to look at it, because you can't really call it, it's not reproductively viable. We don't reproduce hermaphroditically. So sometimes what they can do is if someone has like both kinds of things, they can take away one, accentuate the other, and then they can go on to procreate. But anyways, she goes into all this, why sex matters legally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's a smart lady.
Yeah. And then there's a book that I want to plug. It's not necessarily an easy read, but I think if you're looking as to why this has all happened, what's happening in our schools, how did this get here, this is your book.
Yeah,
It's The Queering of the American Child. Have you read it?
I've seen it.
Yeah. Um, yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So those explain a lot. And one of the ways that I think that this applies, the way I relate this to what I learn in anthroposophy is that the whole transgender phenomena is like another fall, if you will. We had the fall with Lucifer. It was always intended that we would have our own thinking, that we would think on our own. But we and the children can relate to this too so much. It's like, yeah, but you need a lot of training first to be somebody who could think well, right? And it's always intended that one day the sexes, this will actually come together, will merge, and we will then procreate through the word, through the larynx, through the word. It's something that's to come in the future, but now they've jumped the gun. So it's like another, it's analogous to what we call the fall. And one of the very sad things that's happening now is some of the female to male identifying individuals will actually inject, is it testosterone, but they inject right into their larynx to deepen their voice, basically to damage their vocal cords so that they have a deeper voice.
Yeah.
And, this means a lot to me as one who wants to help the evolution of humanity. So there's issues like that. There's also issues of transhumanism. There's even a book called From Transgender to Transhuman.
Right.
So it goes, what? It gets really dark really fast, unfortunately. And how do they sell it to kids? Rainbows and unicorns.
Good point. Yep.
So
Yeah.
that's been my experience at that school. And I've seen it at other schools. I've never seen a Waldorf school fly an American flag. I've never seen them fly any flag. As a matter of fact, I thought I might get fired when I hung an American flag in my 8th grade classroom. When we were studying civics, I told the children about the Pledge of Allegiance and how, I had to say it every morning and I still know it. And they said, we want to say it. I said, you do? I said, yeah, we want to. I said, well, then we need a flag. We can't just do it to the wall. So I hung a flag in the corner and we said it almost every day. And I got to use it as like little mini civics lessons. But have you ever seen a flag flown at a Waldorf school? Yet today, you can go to Waldorf school and they'll be flying the pride flag, the progressive pride
Mm-hmm.
flag.
Mm-hmm.
And you all
We,
know the difference between pride and progressive pride. Pride was
mm-hmm.
the LGB. Progressive pride is just about everything else. They put a brown strip on there for people of color. What that's got to do with anything, I do not know.
Yeah. We had a flag at High Mowing.
Did you really? Was
Yeah, it's
it
still there.
American flag?
An American flag, yeah, right in the middle of the central green of the campus. It's there to this day, as far as I know.
Congratulations. Yeah. So I'm not, swayed one way or the other whether we have a flag or not. I just see the exceptionalism that this
Right.
poses. For example, we always communicate with parents. No, now in this case, we'll deceive the parents, right?
Yeah, it's very strange, isn't it?
It is very strange, and it really has caught hold. I think part of it too, and I see this, I see so many schools, maybe OSNA, wanting, there was a time in the 90s, like I came into Waldorf in 1990, and actually I decided to become a Waldorf teacher after hearing Eugene Schwartz teach about the fourfold human being. And I said, I'm in. But back in those days, childhood illnesses still made a child strong. We were the
Right.
weirdos that said, put that TV in the closet, you know,
Right.
whatnot. And then something happened where neuroscience was offering an explanation or a justification for what we did with our curriculum and our pedagogy.
Right. Yeah, they caught up
Sudden,
eventually.
what's that?
They caught up eventually.
They did. And then from that moment on, it was like this marriage, if you will. It was like this, how can we be more like the mainstream? Can we get this gratification of being like, okay, and we're not the weirdo hippie people? Right? So
Right.
that's kind of what I think. I think the more and more they're trying to keep up with the Joneses and be more like public schools. And we are going to see, and we actually are seeing. So what's happening in schools is there's so many children that are neurodiverse and have anxiety and different things like that. Waldorf is put forth as a healing education, and we need it more than ever. Um, However, I think we need to stand by our principles. I would love to work at a school that said, put away that TV, put away that iPhone.
Right. Right.
We really
Well,
took a strong stand on it instead of saying, what can we do? We really
right.
attracted people who felt that very strongly, and those sorts of things.
Well,
So,
as we know, we can do anything, and the children can do anything if we just give them permission to be themselves, to learn who themselves really is,
right, and they learn it through doing,
to learn it
right?
through doing.
Another thing that's really essential in Waldorf is the practical arts, the woodworking and the gardening and things like that. So I think a lot of anxiety comes from not knowing how the world works.
Right.
And
Good point.
so,
Yep.
we've made it a foundation in Waldorf education of teaching the child how the world works. So they have, they learn all about farming in the third grade, but they have farming classes and gardening classes straight through. They get woodworking, they get clay, they get to take apart computers. Oh,
Yep.
another thing, we teach our sciences phenomenologically, right? Again, how
Right.
does the world work? Well, first you got to observe it, and then we'll take it from there. And one of my students, when we were studying astronomy, are we going to learn about supernovas and quarks? And I said, no, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the night sky and explain what's happening of what we can see. Whatever we can see, we're going to explain it. And then actually all of that, all of the development of their imaginative muscle comes into play when they actually have to extrapolate the imagination and say, okay, if the moon is here, then where's the sun? And where does it move to? And what does it mean that why does it look like the stars are crossing the sky? Things like this. We have to move that in our imagination. It's really cool. And one of my friends who works in a public school said they're taking the middle school science curriculum and making all the demonstrations online, making all videos.
Oh no, really?
Yeah, but
That's
that's not a Waldorf school. That's the regular public schools.
even so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So if I was to say how can we bring forth healthy children,
Right.
keep bringing those living pictures,
Yeah.
keep bringing the archetypal movement. whether it's eurythmy, form drawing, spatial dynamics, those things are, well informed and so healing, so healing.
And there is so much there that you could just get lost in it and have no time for anything else.
Hmm. Well, that is another conversation to be had, since the children can go home and access all sorts of information, right? You can Google anything, you can get everything on the computers. The one thing they're not getting anymore is their hands in the soil, how to build
Hmm.
something, how to do movement. So, would be interesting to
Yeah,
emphasize that more. What if main lesson was practical arts?
there you go. Wouldn't that be something?
So yeah, I'm open to having these kinds of conversations so that we can stay true to the wisdom that is inherent in Waldorf that's been put forth, because it's there.
Hmm.
We feel it every time we see it acted out. When we were doing the Rube Goldberg project, I thought how perfect this is at the time when they're really in the full thrust of, puberty, really, and going down, sliding down the slippery slope, that they're fully in it. And that means that their projective thinking, their cause and effect thinking is really starting to come in, be engaged and developed, right? And mastered. And of course, that takes many years. But what do we do in physics? We work with the 6 basic machines, and then we build a Rube Goldberg project, which is all about, well, if this thing swings like this and hits this, then that's going to roll down there. And
Right.
so we have them doing it. Isn't that beautiful?
Doing it. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah. So we're teaching them cause and effect thinking by doing a Rube Goldberg project, not by
Yeah.
saying, now this is cause and effect thinking.
Yeah. Right.
And that, to me, the more I can do that as a teacher, discover that genius and be able to bring that forth. That's what that's how I want to improve myself as a teacher.
Well, that's amazing.
The process, right? It's a
Yeah.
process. Yeah. So, do you have any other questions, or were there any other in the chat that you saw,
Um,
or comments or anything?
I didn't see any further ones. Um, yeah, I think we've covered anyway what the content was in the other inquiries, but I think that's awesome, and I think honestly your kids and your students are lucky to have you.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. Um, so we've been at this for about an hour and a half. I think it's time to wrap it up, unless there's another
Yep.
question.
Well, one did just pop in.
Good.
Um, so who do we know who first implemented DEI programs in the standard curriculum? I don't know if that means Waldorf or, I mean, I'm assuming it means Waldorf. And was there any kind of approval process going on?
I don't know. I'm not the person to ask that. Sorry.
Yeah, hard to know, right?
Yeah. So I haven't researched that. So, like I said, my big run-in with the school, the major one, was the transgender ideology, and to a lesser extent, the
Yeah,
dress code and some other things. But
right,
um, but I don't know. That's a good question. And um,
right. Well, we know
one
where
thing.
it ultimately comes from, right?
Hmm.
Is what you were alluding to is
So with
what,
this, where did it come
well,
from? This?
well, uh, I mean, what can one do to distract us from our ongoing efforts to nourish the child with beauty and freedom, you
Oh,
know?
well, what you can do is get someone to think emotionally.
Hmm. You
So
mean in the good
sometimes
sense?
when I brought up questions about maybe, having something about their incarnating process or something like that, I spoke to one of the teachers and she said, "That is so cruel. That is so cruel." What I said. Like, I
Hmm.
have friends who are trans, and I would never say that to them. That is so cruel. And I was like, wow, okay. Then I was able to ask another teacher after after the different sections said that they did not want to hear a presentation by me about why I was opposed to bringing this speaker to come to the students about transgender. Um, One morning, she was asking me a question, asking my advice. I gave it to her, and she said, "You're so wise." I was like, "Okay." And I said, "Can I ask you a question? If you think I'm so wise, how come you don't want to hear from me about this other topic?" And she took a moment, she took a deep breath, and she goes, "Because I have a couple of transgender friends, and I don't want to change the way I feel about them."
Right.
Now, I knew enough to know that that's where I needed to stop.
Hmm.
And it's not ask a follow-up question, just say,
Right.
"Okay." And it was an education for me because I knew at that point I was up against emotional thinking. And after that, one of my superiors came to me and told me that I shouldn't be confronting people at school or something like that. And I was like, who did I confront? And so I went to her and I said, did I upset you when I asked you that question? She goes, "I was upset because you were upset." And I was like, I wasn't upset. I was genuinely curious. But she kind of threw it all on
Right.
me. But you see how
Yeah.
these things go. Instead of her saying to me directly, "You seem really upset about this, and I don't really want to talk about it," or "I'd prefer
Right.
if you don't bring it up because you're you're pushing me," or something like that. But I did everything in my power to sound as curious as possible because I really was curious. Like, I just really want to know, if you think I'm so wise, how come you don't want to hear about this? Hear me say something about this. And so, yeah, it's kind of gonna be interesting. Would be really great if we can have conversations, and that's where the conversations need to be had, and that was one of my points. We need to
Yeah.
be discussing these issues, not bringing it to the children. Or before we bring it to the children, we need to have a thorough discussion of it and see how
Right.
it supports our aims. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that well, one of the things that I'm getting out of the many things that we've talked about today is we really need to have the courage and just insist on talking about it, talking about the beautiful things that we're trying to do through our Waldorf curricula, and also the things that are perhaps distractions or that
Mhm.
can subvert those beautiful things if they do, but we should be able to talk about it and we should insist on it. I think it's really important what you've conveyed in that sense.
Mhm. Thanks. Courage. I've got a quote here on my water bottle. I made stickers and gave water bottles to all my students when we graduated. Courage, sorry. Courage is the first of human qualities because it is the quality which guarantees the others. Aristotle.
Mm,
And so,
right.
exactly, even me coming and speaking to you tonight, I felt some trepidation. Yeah, well, what if somebody gets angry with me or, ooh,
Sure.
kind
Yeah.
of thing. But
Well,
but it's but there are other things at play. It's important. So, on that note, I would love to be contacted um,
yeah.
with either further questions, but mostly collaboration. What can we do to get this conversation happening? Could we have a conference where we come and have a lot of discussion time? We could
Mm,
have presentations and lots of discussion because it's
mm-hmm.
through discussion that we come to a point of view. That's why free speech is so, so important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So, well, we will include your contact information along with the recording of this
let's do
event
that.
in a day
And
or
I'll say
two.
it too. Yeah, let me
You
just
go,
say it.
go ahead,
It's
go ahead.
it's Thea Blair at gmail.com. So TheaBlair at gmail.com. Yeah, feel free to email me and let's see if we can't have more conversation with everyone. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you for providing this platform. And let's do more of this. Maybe there's other people that want to get on and speak. I
Yeah,
would love to hear from them.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for taking us this step further in the bigger conversation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to end without saying that I feel tremendous gratitude for all of my colleagues at my last school. We had a different point of view on this. They think I'm crazy. I think they're crazy. Um, but I felt very supported as a teacher there, and I enjoyed their company. They were wonderful human beings. So I don't, there's not antipathy there for them as individuals or even as to the school collectively. But yeah, I do have, difficulties with the approach, the DEI stuff, being unquestioning and what I think is deviating from reality. Um, but otherwise, I really appreciate my colleagues.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we could tell that really.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
good. Yeah, because
Yeah.
that's the rub. It's hard,
Yeah.
I would love to be able to stay and be the one that's always the fly in the ointment and, "Oh, that's just her spouting
Right.
off again." I don't know. But, yeah. But it's not to be, So,
We do what we can, um, and we'll just try to keep pursuing the highest good wherever
mm,
we are.
absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much because I know you had to prepare for this event and you're pretty busy, so I know you took the time out in the middle of your day. For us, it's just the middle of the night.
No,
But
it's good. No, we're good. I'm happy
but
to be here.
yeah.